So, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I apologize for the delay. Very sorry. One of our speakers and friends had a problem, but luckily enough, he was able to solve, and he will be joining us in 10 minutes. I'm talking about Steve Clark. So we'll have the pleasure to see him and listen to his presentation and his remarks later on. There will be a little change in the order of speakers, but in the meanwhile, let me first of all welcome you to this session. The session is, and I'm happy to see that the room is really full. I was hoping and expecting, not just for personal reasons, but because we are going to discuss a crucial issue that in communication terms and for communicators has a special role when it comes to looking back at what has been done and looking forward at what this means for our future efforts. We're focusing on the European election campaign. So what worked, what did not work, and thanks. So I'm also on camera. Yeah, I think now it works and you have the right person on the camera. Good start, no, isn't it? So we're looking at this. We're not just looking back. It's, the overall team of Eurocom is looking forward, but as the president of the European Committee said this morning, you cannot look forward without looking back. And with this, I introduce myself. My name is Michele Cercone. I'm the head of unit of events at the EU Committee of the Region, which means that I'm the lucky one who has the pleasure to coordinate the organization and planning of Eurocom. And all that you see, it's also not just because of the fantastic team that is behind this event, but also thanks to the interinstitutional cooperation that helps us making this an important forum for discussion also with other institutions, which brings me to just quickly introducing the speakers of the panel. Jens Mester, head of unit of the Interinstitutional Relations, Corporate Contracts at DG COM at the European Commission. Dr. Franziska Marquardt from the Amsterdam School of Communication Research from the University of Amsterdam, and he will join us, as I said, a bit later. Stephen Clark, Director for Liaison Offices of the European Parliament, DG Communication, one of the brains behind the campaign, the communication campaign for the election. So the scope of the session of the workshop is quite clear. I will briefly just help you with mapping a little bit the house, with a bit of a housekeeping. You know that you can count on translation. We will be together for around 1 hour and a half. We will hear from all our speakers who also have a presentation, visual presentation, and then we will have a bit of discussion around the themes that we will be listening, and then we will also open. We'll have an open debate with the floor. So if you have questions at the end, please don't hesitate to let us know. It would be good if you would present yourself so that we know exactly who you are. This said, and with a slight change of order, I will give the floor to Jens for his presentation. We will then decide according to the moment Steve arrives how to follow it up. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Michele, and very happy to be here. It's a very important topic, and I'm in particular very, very happy not to see very many familiar faces, because that simply means that we are not talking to ourselves, we are not talking to the Brussels bubble only, but you are coming here from member states, member regions, cities, etc. You were all in one way or the other probably involved in the elections mobilization. So I really appreciate that, and I'm really eager to share with you a little bit our European Commission experience in how we contributed to the overall voter mobilization and how we work together with the European Parliament. Obviously, the choreography is now a little bit changed, and it would have made full sense that Stephen Clark starts, because obviously the institutional elections campaign of the Parliament is at the heart of the EU's communication efforts. But that's the way it is, and I will now start from Commission side. Our efforts, our communication and mobilization efforts ahead of the European elections started much earlier. I think that's very important. It did not happen in a political vacuum, obviously, but since the start of the Juncker Commission in November 2014, it was clear for us communicators at the European Commission that we needed to really double our efforts to reach out to citizens, to mobilize citizens, to regain trust of citizens. I think this was the big political priority, the overarching priority of the Juncker Commission since the start of the mandate. And I think this is very important if we consider then in more detail what we did before the elections, because ultimately it does not mean that the Commission set up its own institutional elections campaign just because the elections were approaching. It meant that we are, so to say, gearing up our already reinforced communication and outreach efforts towards the European elections. So that meant that we were fully backed and supported by the political level in what we did communication-wise, and this was important. The question is, of course, in how far we contributed our share in the overall mobilization and voter participation. This is probably impossible to tell, at least from our side. Scientifically, it's not possible to tell a clear link of causality that the Commission's share is high or low in the overall mobilization, but we believe we did our best in this overall very conducive internal political context. So that was my short introduction. I think, Steve, if you want to start now with your European Parliament.
Because yes, we can ping pong a little bit. It's just perfect. So Jens just started with his introduction, but as we were saying, the choreography is such that it would certainly make more sense if you would be starting with your presentation. So without further delay, I think that I will leave you the floor.
Okay. So first, what do is I apologise for turning up like this in a rush, but there you go, best laid plans and all of that. So I have a little presentation about the lessons we learned from this campaign, which is coming any second now. I will try to be succinct. We actually learned an awful lot from this campaign, as you might imagine. I think I was here last year. In fact, I've been here 2 years running, talking about this campaign. The first year was with cats.
Yes.
Some of you may remember that if you were here 2 years ago. Yes. I see everyone seems to remember that one. Last year I had a bit more to go with, and now I'm coming sort of after the event to talk a little bit about what happened. So the lessons we learned from this. First thing to say is we look back and learn lessons from the past, in fact, from 2014. We're not here to talk about 2014, but recently someone prompted me to look at that campaign again, and it was fascinating, I have to say. It was a great campaign, but it was very different, and I think the thing that we learned, the main lesson we learned is spend more money, time, effort on distribution and less on production. That was the really key lesson. The other thing is, and I think about this with hindsight, I've realized this, that's when we learned to do social media. In that campaign, we learned how to use it, we learned how to promote it, we learned how to use money and social media, which is of course very important, to the extent that that was the bedrock of the 2019 campaign, but we didn't really think about it anymore because it was just there, it was something we did. We also spent a lot of time looking at the present. There's a picture some of you may be familiar with. Some of you may even have been there. I am a pixel in that photo, I'm pleased to say. How are campaigns working now? How are they working these days? So we looked at a lot of things. This was one, on both sides of the Brexit referendum, very interesting campaigns. There were obviously other campaigns too in this period since the last 2014 election that taught us a lot. So what did they actually teach us? One lesson we learned, I suppose you say organisationally, is that for the first time we didn't go with a full service agency. We decided to do this ourselves, to internalise. We realised we had the capacity, and there were lots of things that we could actually do better, largely because we wouldn't have to go through the sort of the pedagogic process of teaching an agency about how we work and what we do and all the constraints and psychoses we have as a sort of a European public institution. So that was very important. Didn't mean that we didn't use external consultants for some things, and indeed for one very important part of the campaign we did, but it gave us the opportunity to use more niche operators for more specific purposes, and I think thereby get a really good quality outcome for those particular parts of the campaign. Don't be scared to care, I say on this slide. This was a campaign where we had an explicit mandate for it to be for something. It was a pro-European campaign. It was about the benefits of European democracy, why it's important, why we should support it, why we should commit to it, all those kind of things. We actually stood for something in this campaign. So that was part of the political mandate, which is really important. But that was also one of the reasons it worked, I think. The emotional dimension was crucial. This was a lesson we learned from many other campaigns. If you're not engaging people's emotions, you're not engaging them at all. And this was, I've said this on both of the two previous occasions I was talked about this campaign in this room, but the proof was in the pudding. We saw that really this sort of connection that we were able to make with people on an emotional or sort of committed level was very important to the way the campaign played out. And it gave us that that allowed us to convene people, work with people, and then you actually manage to get people moving. This whole idea of mobilization was the big, if you like, the big difference between 2014 and 2019. In 2014, we did a communications campaign. In 2019, we did an activation campaign. So that is a very fundamental difference. It changed our lives very significantly. It changed the kind of job we do, the kind of people we are, the way we interact with other people. We were asking people to do this campaign for us, essentially. The interface with the audience was largely other people. It was important, therefore, to build a community. And that was, as you know, in this campaign, we used different techniques for doing that. We had the online platform, this time imvoting.eu. We worked heavily with partners and other organizations who wanted to join into the campaign. We had a lot of people coming to us spontaneously, but we also worked very hard to build up networks of all these kinds. This picture is a seminar that we held for partner organizations in Brussels, but we were doing the same thing at local level through our offices in the member states as well. Around what I hope was a fairly self-explanatory and simple message, but with this important twist this time, and that tells you something about what we were doing under the surface. We were trying to talk to people who didn't vote last time, either because they were too young or because they couldn't be bothered, what we call the soft abstainers. And we tried to be human, of course. That's the other thing I would say. This links to the emotion, of course. The stories, the narratives that we use were tended to be about human beings. We had this principle that we applied in this campaign. There is a duty of raising public awareness of the date and that kind of thing about the election. So we had what we called an air game. This was the inform all strategy. So that was a lot of, what you might call traditional work, press work, media work, and so on, and a convince some. And that was this mobilization, get people to vote, get people to get involved in the campaign. This is actually a photo taken from the launch of the campaign at the European Youth Event, which is where we started the ground game side of the campaign. Data is decisive. We needed to be very sure about who we were talking to. If you try to talk to everybody or convince everybody, you're going to convince nobody. So we looked around, and I've mentioned this phrase already, the soft abstainers, people who we identified as being those who didn't vote last time, who were not inclined to vote, but not for strong reasons. As it turned out, when we analyzed it in, I think, 20 out of 27 countries we were talking to at the beginning of the campaign, the primary target groups were young people. Those are the people who tended to be in that category of soft abstainer. Not everywhere. So in some countries it was slightly older people, in some countries it was other categories, but youth was a fairly strong trend across the board, and that comes out at the end of this in terms of what happened in the end. So data for us, and that whole sort of backup of having the information, the knowledge, was very important. What was also important, and this, you might think it sounds contradictory to what I said about emotions, but content turned out to be critical. You get people by engaging their emotions, but then they need something to work with. If you're asking them to work with you, then they need something to work with. And the thing that we're hearing all the time now is we need content, we need facts, we need to be able to tell people real things that they can relate to. So this is a screenshot of our website, what Europe does for me. This was one of the most popular products we had. It wasn't perfect, but it did a great job for a lot of people in answering that question, what did Europe ever do for me? Stories, narratives, I mean, you know about storytelling. This was also something we really worked on in terms of linking the campaign and the Parliament's work to specific issues that people care about. Going local was important to us. A decentralized campaign, much more radically so than we've ever done in the past. And interestingly, you know, we always, in these kind of sessions and meetings, we always talk about digital and how everything's got to be digital and social media. A return to low-tech is one of the counterintuitive parts of what's going on in campaigning right now. You know, you need the digital, you need your convening power and everything, but you also need to then do something with people when you get them. And this was, especially if you're mobilizing, this is what you need. And this kind of thing, this is in Vilnius, don't be a couch potato. It worked incredibly well. You know, get a lot of purchase with this kind of thing. The media, of course, there I am on Bulgarian Breakfast TV. This is just like, you know, when does that kind of thing ever happen to you in normal life? It did to me. The media were really interested in the campaign as well. So I find, you know, we all found ourselves talking to the media about the campaign, about the elections. There was a thirst, a real appetite for talking about the elections this time, and that was to do with the atmosphere out there, which was also, I think, very working in our favour in this campaign. The media want to know. This is my colleague from Rome presenting the video, the baby video on Breakfast TV on Italian TV. Getting there, we found a lot of energy out there. Again, I mean, I say this was a great campaign. It mobilized a lot of people. It wasn't just us mobilizing people, of course. People were self-mobilizing a lot. And there you see a lot of just pictures of people waving blue and yellow flags. There was an awful lot of that going on. It sort of went out of all proportion. And of course, never forget, there is actually politics going on here as well. There's a campaign, and people are vying for votes. And of course, we spent a lot of time talking about the lead candidates, and then perhaps we can discuss later how that all worked out. But, you know, the political dimension is really important. Of course, we were not in a partisan role here, but we were nevertheless there. I want to very quickly show you the pictures. When I talk about this campaign, these are the pictures I show. So, Instagram posts, people meeting up in pubs, the Kiesmannen in the Netherlands who did theatre shows about the elections. The wonderful influencer, Diana Zur-Leuven, I don't know if anyone knows her or follows her. She's mainly nail varnish and makeup, but it was also European elections when she has 750,000 followers, so that's great. Valérie Thatcher, who walked from Lyon to Brussels, wearing a flag and stopping everyone she met to tell them about the elections and why it was important. That is real grassroots stuff. Kiesvrouwen, just for the sake of gender equality, they were also working in Holland. We had the celebrities. Here we have a Slovenian dancer, a Spanish actor, and an Estonian comedian, all of whom did things for us in this campaign. Greek writer, the wonderful Lorenzo Baglioni in Italy did a song which the Italians will know, yes, which was absolutely hilarious. It was wonderful. That was also done under the banner of This Time I'm Voting. You also see the candidates debate there. Uomo Vogue, or Vogue Uomo, which way around is it? They wanted to get involved, so they got involved, various models started wearing T-shirts for us and so on. We have people handing out leaflets in Dublin, we have a Croatian president, we have Polish models. This was all an initiative by Rem Koolhaas and Wolfgang Tillemans. Helped us out with, well, they had their own campaign, but they talked to us all the time about it. Here you have a model wearing a sweatshirt and someone in The Hague writing Ik stem on a Starbucks cup, which is also really cool. Footballers, professional football associations, DHL, and Google, all of these people, everyone turfed into this campaign. Lime scooters, free rides to the polling station on polling day. Lufthansa painted a plane. They did that, they didn't ask us, they just told us afterwards, which was great. And the red thing is a nightclub ticket in Bucharest. You could only get in if you proved you'd voted that day. So, Tinder. This is the one we love to show. On the left there. Lots of film people in the Cannes Film Festival and a Slovak game show. And so it goes on. The point is, and when I show these photos, who are those people? Not one of them is a European official. Not one of them works for the European Parliament. They were all other people. This is what this campaign was all about. Did it work? Well, it worked insofar as we had this wonderful announcement to make. This is my boss. 50.5%. We beat the 50. This was just joy unalloyed. We had to be sure enough. It actually went up slightly, the definitive figure afterwards. So yes, that's the headline, of course. This is one I like, of course. You would say, I would like it, wouldn't I? The overall turnout was revised. That was a 50.6 something. Okay, I've rounded to 50.7. But in our target groups, that turnout was nearly 8 points higher. So it shows that there was a disproportionate mobilization of people, the people at least we were trying to talk to. And that's very interesting. And of course, many of those people were young. And if you look at the data we've gathered since this election, you see remarkable results in many, many countries where the turnout in the youth group, the 18 to, or the 16 to 24s, depending on where you are, often doubled or more than doubled. In Spain, it was absolutely amazing. It went to like 41%, 41 points in terms of the percentage turnout of young people. In the Netherlands, I know it doubled in that younger age group. So there were lots of things going on like that under the surface in this campaign, which also actually changes the nature of the electorate a little bit here, which is quite an interesting point to discuss, perhaps. This is someone else's narrative. It wasn't ours. This was a stunt that was done on the day. The point they were making is that the Eurosceptic wave that had been predicted by many in the media for a long time before this elections did not happen. That's obviously a point of view, but the picture is a telling one. What happens now? The community, we hope, will live on. We don't want to lose all of its energy and all of these contacts and networks we have. There will continue to be a focus on youth and a focus with partners. And in fact, this time I'm voting.eu is now together.eu, and that's where we intend to go in the future. We're still consulting with our volunteers and our partners and all the people we work with about exactly what we want to do with this, but we're getting there. And that is that. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Stephen. Of course, we all believe what you say, and we believe your presentation. But I'm sure that you wouldn't mind then if we gave it a try about the success of the campaign here live. What do you say? Shall we give it a try? We have a nice tool called Slido. You all know it, so I know that you all have your GSM. If maybe we can make a great use of your GSM now in this room, and is to go on slido.com. And then once you're there, you just enter hashtag EuropeCom. So #key and then EuropeCom. If I'm not mistaken, it's session 2. Great. And then once you're there, the question is, were you exposed to the Go Vote campaigns outside of the working environment? Very much, not so much, a little, not at all. We see it coming, more and more. '74. There's room for improvement there. It's, okay, 80. It's a bit better. The room is much bigger than that. So please make your effort. Okay, very good. We start getting there now. Let's see if we can get to 100. Who's okay? Looks like an auction there. House. We're almost there. Come on, little effort. Okay. We'll get there, that's for sure. Ah, great, great job. Thank you so much. So let's see. Very much, it's going now to 26%, a little 40%, not so much 26, not at all 8%. So not at all 8% is, to me, quite a striking figure, which means that for the rest, whether not so much, very much, or not so much, a little, but you were exposed to the campaign. So it already says that very much it's at 26%, quite a lot. Remember, we're answering outside of the working environment, and a little 41%. So we can move, I think, to the next question. I'm looking at my colleagues. We can move to the next question. Did you retain any messages from the campaigns you saw? Also there, I think that we should get, now that you have a bit more of expertise, we can get largely over 100, which looks the case. Very well, thank you so much. And I would say that as we approach 100, the picture becomes quite clear. And it's largely in favor of yes. So this confirms that the messages from the campaigns reached out quite widely. 104, thank you so much again. Great effort. I think we can move to the third question. How impactful would you rate the communication campaigns overall? We're going from 1 to 5. Still moving. Now I have in front of me the definition of moving targets. I finally have it clear. Very good, very good. So we are already at 109, 110. So the reading, you can see it 3, which is already, I would say, quite sufficiently impactful. But you have 30% 4, 6% 5, so the maximum rate, and only 18% would judge it less than very, very little impactful. So I guess that 114, quite representative. Thank you very much for the effort and for your contribution. That makes things, of course, much easier. I didn't have many doubts, but you absolutely nailed it. It was perfect. But this is also to say that, of course, I guess that common sense, based simply on what we could see, I really share the assessment that the impact and the figures that are then showing the impact that the campaign had are quite close to what people feel about it. I'm Italian, so you made an example, and that was all over the place. This Serenata. Serenata is a love song that you sing to your partner or someone you want to conquer in Italy, and there's a full brand or layer of music which is called neomelodica, which is exactly this romantic, very tender way of singing, expressing feelings, and this was done for and to the European elections in order to get closer also to young people who tend to listen to that kind of music, and it became viral on social, it was everywhere. So it was, again, one of those examples where this was not someone who was from the EU institution, not nearly close to the EU institutions, but still it had a huge impact, and all people started to talk and discuss, and this went as an effect, an impact, a direct consequence. It went on all Italian media who started to talk about this. So I guess that these examples then you can find for almost all countries. This said, we go back to Jens. Thank you so much for being so patient and for letting us go back to the previous order. Now, your time.
Thanks, Michele. And before I continue, let me just say how much in the Commission we appreciated really the Parliament's concept and campaign strategy, because it was indeed a very courageous and new approach that you were running. And at the very beginning, back in 2017, when we were discussing for the first time together, at different levels, it was not at all clear if in the end it would work out, because it also implied giving away some control about things, how it would turn out in the end. So it worked out well, and I'm very glad that we could be part of these efforts indeed. So what I was saying before was that for the Juncker Commission, it was since the start of the mandate a priority to regain trust of citizens through various initiatives and new approaches, and let me just name two of them. One are the citizens' dialogues, the so-called citizens' dialogues that are essentially town hall meetings bringing together our commissioners, our president, our vice presidents, first vice president Timmermans at the time was very active as well in citizens' dialogues, in a direct interaction with citizens to listen to them and engage with them. So that was one example where, compared to the previous elections in 2014, the Commission really multiplied its efforts of outreach and went local into the member states, where I think the number, by the time of the elections, of citizens' dialogues reached 1,700. And compared to the previous period, 2013-14, it was a very modest number of around 30. 3-0. So that just shows how really politically the approach was changed, and going out was becoming the new normal. Then the second new thing that happened since the start of the Juncker Commission's mandate was our approach to communication. It was organized and implemented in a much more corporate spirit, not leaving the different departments of the Commission alone with their, let's say, hobby horses in terms of policy areas, but really join forces, resources, ideas, and concepts, identify stories, human stories and examples close to people's hearts and minds that we could communicate in a truly corporate spirit. So that was just to mention two examples. So at the time when we were coming together, Parliament and Commission in 2017, 2 years before the elections, to discuss what could be done together to maximize our efforts and create synergies, it was obvious that we could build on a very strong basis and that the main challenge would essentially be to identify how to create the synergies and how to really reinforce your campaign in terms of your target groups, young people, students, multipliers, etc., celebrities as well, and how to optimize also the use of our outreach channels, the citizens' dialogues, also the Europe Direct contact centers, information centers, sorry, in the member states, the representations, the EP liaison offices that often work in the same premises on the ground in member states, and that gave true meaning to this decentralized approach of the Parliament's campaign. So all this was then discussed and transformed into a very pragmatic cooperation between the two institutions. Very decentralized, very corporate, and very synergetic in a positive meaning. So after all, I think it's fair to say it was indeed a joint effort between Commission and Parliament, but not only. I mean, Steve mentioned so many examples. I mean, it's clearly a joint effort of many different actors building around the Parliament's campaign and other initiatives. And it can be considered as a joint success in that sense. Now, let me just name a few things that are maybe not yet totally obvious, but which deserve being mentioned. We try to maximize also the use of the EU emblem in our communication on both sides. Why? Because ultimately it was about the future of Europe. It was not about the future of a single institution. It was about the future of Europe. And as you might remember, since 2017, the Commission was also in another very strong mobilization exercise, namely involving people in having their say on how to shape the future of Europe, the so-called white paper on the future of Europe process. So this joined in very nicely under a common EU emblem. So terminology mattered. We tried in communication terms to avoid the expression EP elections, European Parliament elections. I think that was an agreement on both sides among the communicators. We rather prefer to talk about European elections. Pragmatic cooperation, I mentioned already. People talked to each other, shared their planning, shared their calendars, their ideas in a very open-minded way, which sounds obvious, but in reality, compared to the previous elections and the predecessor elections, is not so obvious as many might think. Targeted and complementary mobilization. For example, if you take the Commission's EU and Me campaign, it is obvious that the target group is young people, 18 to 25 years, and this is exactly the target group also that the Parliament wanted to mobilize through the This Time I'm Voting campaign. As Steve has mentioned, the highly decentralized character made it very important that the EP liaison offices and the representations of the Commission in member states worked closely together. And of course, that also at headquarters, many things were done together. We were joining forces also in the distribution of the Choose Your Future video clip, the Go to Vote clip, which I'm still impressed of about the overall approach in dealing with the emotions and motivating people to vote through emotions, very strong emotions. So we, for example, mobilized through our DG for Connect, for communication and network technologies, the European Cinemas Network, which managed to convince 200 cinemas all over Europe to broadcast for free, or to show for free in their cinemas the Go to Vote clip. And we were working obviously together, including with the European External Action Service, to tackle disinformation, which is of course a topic on its own, which was more relevant than ever before compared to previous elections. So roughly speaking, the Commission tried to communicate and mobilize along three strands. The most obvious is to communicate about what Europe does, engage with people on what Europe does for you. We were multiplying also the What Europe Does for Me tool for the Parliament, from the Parliament. Through our corporate campaigns, we try to explain through human stories, concrete examples, what the European Union is doing, not what the Commission is doing, what the European Union is doing. I think this is something that also corresponded to something that was revealed earlier on in the autumn 2018 Eurobarometer, where the respondents of that very important survey said that the most likely or the better they feel informed about what the EU does concretely for them in their daily lives, the more likely it is that they will go to vote. So from this, you see, that was the single most important reason that people really mentioned. I think 43% of respondents felt that they would easier go to vote if they feel what the European Union does in their immediate context. Then why and how to vote, that's the more obvious, more procedural, information related aspect of our work. We cooperated very closely with the Parliament to feed the European elections webpage, where you had all the information about registration deadlines, procedures, how and where can I vote as a voter. So that's of course, equally important. Let me say here, in particular, that our DG Just, that is also in charge for citizens' rights, cooperated very closely also with the Parliament to target mobile citizens, 18 million mobile citizens across Europe, people not living in their home member state, which also had to be informed about the European elections. So we put energy and money in this mobile citizens campaign as well. And finally, how to engage, a very important element where through the citizens dialogues, through transnational dialogues organized by the Europe Direct information centers locally, or through online consultations on the future of Europe, all this was carried out to mobilize people. So further concrete examples, I just mentioned the names of the 3 corporate campaigns that we have been running at cruising speed until the elections. InvestEU, EU and Me, and EU Protects. There's also another series, corporate video series called EU in the Life, A Day in the Life of an EU Citizen, where you have very nice and humorous material targeting each member state individually about the reality of what the EU does for people in their immediate context. Then we had a number of outreach activities which normally do not happen. For example, former Erasmus students or current Erasmus students, trainees of the Commission, former trainees, Solidarity Corps members, etc., were targeted with election-related content. Our Europe Direct Contact Center, the EU helpline, if you so want, was also receiving election-related information. Almost 100,000 people received it through that. Then we produced a communication toolkit that we published, that we shared with civil society as well, with member states, with regions, with the links to the most important tools. Cinemas Network I mentioned already. Yeah, and at the end, I just want to highlight one aspect. Steve also has mentioned third-party endorsers that were crucial to reinforce and amplify our elections mobilization efforts, like Lufthansa companies, etc., but also, of course, civil society movements like Pulse of Europe in Germany or across Europe by now. Let me add to that another very nice example, as I find, and I say that not because I'm of that region, but because objectively, probably, it's a very nice example, and I just want to show you this little clip. It's a football club, fully embracing, just weeks ahead of the European elections, Europe, and we endorsed. So just as a little illustration of what is possible, and often without people, companies, sports, clubs receiving money or having to be pushed, but because they embrace it, they want to participate in that. So let me just conclude with 2 elements that did not work as foreseen. I mean, that is also something we need to say. A couple of weeks before the elections, Facebook restricted the pan-European advertising, political advertising policy, and that, of course, came totally unexpected for the institutions, and we had to deal with that. I mean, just to mention it very briefly here, and of course also the very diverse and heterogeneous national restrictions and silence periods before the elections was also something where we somehow had to work around, especially those implementing these communication and outreach activities in the member states. And our role was then not so much to give a central message how to behave to everybody in the member states, in the representations in our case, but rather to hint at these diverging rules and consolidate them, put them together, inform them, make them aware, and tell them you have to observe these national rules, hoping that the overall train was steaming ahead already in a way and had created momentum that would not be slowed down anymore by these last-minute breaks, so to say. So I'm coming to the end. We will build on that. We are in touch with the Parliament to shape our future cooperation, building on this wonderful experience. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jens. So, lots of good ingredients, the right recipe, but was the food well cooked and tasty? And on this, I don't think that we can trust any of us. Like, we are part of the institutions, and you cannot be player and referee at the same time, I guess. But, of course, no worries, because we have here exactly someone who can highlight and tell us in how far these campaigns or these efforts, these communication efforts, were successful. Franziska will talk about the European Union's projects and exactly illustrating the degree to which citizens were exposed and engaged with different forms of communication efforts during the campaign. This one and this one. And you'll be on, well, perfect.
Thank you, Michele. Thank you, everybody. Can I get the presentation, please? So I'm a scholar in political communication, and I work at the University of Amsterdam. And I'm a part of a research project that's funded by the European Research Council. So I'm not entirely impartial. No, but this is a project that's a larger team effort. It's led by Professor Claes de Vreese at the University of Amsterdam. And in this project, we try to explain what influences in general turnout at elections for the European Parliament, what different factors, both on the individual and the structural level, play a role in that, but also, since it's a political communication department, what role information plays in this context. And this is what I'll be trying to talk about a little today in the context of what worked, what did not at the European elections. And we called this this research this time I'm not voting, in a little contextualizing in line with the European Parliament's campaign for turnout, because I will tell you both which efforts engaged citizens throughout the campaign, but also which didn't and under which conditions. I don't think I have to tell any of you about the high turnout in the elections this year. We were all very happy about that. But what we also need to take into consideration that turnout varied considerably between the different member states, right? We had a low 23% in Slovakia up to 89% in Belgium. And there's a lot of different reasons for these different levels of turnout in the member states. And there's a lot of research that we've also been engaging with that takes this into account. We know, for example, that in some member states, voting is compulsory. Compulsory, is that the word? Yeah. Thank you. While in others it's not. In some member states, people can go to the voting booth on the weekend, which encourages turnout. So there's stuff like that affects turnout on the more aggregate level within member states, and we can take this into account, of course. But we also know that this is not telling the whole story, right? Why some people do decide to exercise their democratic right for European parliamentary elections, while others don't. There's a lot of variance on the individual level as well, and this is what we tried to look into in more detail. And for that, we have data from 10 different European member states, European Union member states that you see here, that are also kind of nicely distributed in terms of turnout at these elections, which is of course not why we chose them in the first place. This is data we have been collecting from public opinion and individual data over the course of at least a couple of months, in some countries a couple of years, where we repeatedly get in touch with citizens and ask them both about their attitudes towards the European Union, how they get their information, who they talk to, and also, of course, how they vote in national elections, for example. But as you can see, from the Czech Republic, 29% up to Denmark at that 66. There's a lot of variation we have in our country selection where we collected this public opinion data as well. And immediately in the run-up to the European parliamentary elections, we asked people how often they engaged in a number of different activities that are, in a larger sense, related to the campaign. Not specifically related to what Steve also talked about, this time I'm voting campaign, but also campaign information more generally. And Jens just mentioned, I just looked up the number, the September 2018 Eurobarometer data, 43% of citizens in this survey said that they would be more inclined to turn out to vote if they knew more about what the European Union does and also how it affects their individual lives. So information plays an important role, and I mean, this is Europecom, I don't have to tell you that. But we also said that information encompasses a lot of different things. It's not only what you see on your Instagram feed or what you maybe hear on the radio, if at all anymore, but it also encompasses the type of advertising that you encounter from political parties, pan-European political parties as well. But it also has something to do with the way you communicate with others, talk about politics, discussions, but also voice your own opinion about the EU and about the elections. And we try to capture all of these different things on the individual data, as I said, in these 10 different member states, and ask people how often they did these different things. And you can see that there's a lot of stuff that people don't actually do very often. That's the red bars, that's active communication online, for example, whereas they often receive information through the traditional media. That's media coverage in newspapers, TV, radio about the election, which is also what you would expect, right? A lot of outreach through media coverage, which is also what we often, of course, encourage. People get most of their information about what the EU does and how it affects them from general news media. You also see that people saw a lot of campaign posters. I always say that's a very European thing. Campaign posters play a big role in our campaign environment. They are visual reminders to tell people it's election day, you have to go out and vote. And then there's stuff like event attendance or talking with people online about the elections or the EU, which happens very rarely, and people don't really engage in that a lot of times. And then when we ask them how often do you actually do that, and with this information, we also had access to their self-reported turnout. So we asked them after the election, so did you turn out and go to the elections, the European parliamentary elections this year? And that's self-reported turnout, so a lot of people said they did go to vote. Probably not all of them did, but even when we take this into account, we see that there are a lot of things that actually, if we connect this data, pushed turnout and motivated people to go to the voting booths this year. Whenever they talk with family and friends about EU politics or the elections, that is a guaranteed turnout booster. Political discussion within close networks, mostly those that share your opinion, is a guarantee or increases the likelihood that people go to vote. Seeing posters, at least very, very often, not so much regularly, but actually very often increases turnout, which is really this argument that I mentioned earlier about the visual reminder. If people are told it's election day, you have to go out on posters, that really works. If people actively search for information, also online, they are more likely to go out to vote. And a lot of these things you will probably also see has something to do with a higher engagement and a higher degree of political interest in the first place. People who are more interested in the elections and the EU, search for more information online, are more likely to turn out to vote in the end as well. Getting information by parties, so also potentially biased information. And this does not specifically ask for what parties people received material from. Actually also boosted turnout. And if people made the effort and tried to tell others that they should vote, or actually talked about that they voted themselves and who they voted for in interpersonal discussion, is also a good indicator for turnout eventually. On the other hand, there are consistent and negative influences for the likelihood that people will participate in the elections, and these negative effects are consistent across all the 10 countries that I just talked about. If people received an increasing amount of information through traditional media, and I said that was radio, newspaper, and TV news about the elections, the likelihood that they will turn out decreases. So does talking with others online about the elections. So in contrast to political discussions with family and friends, which boosts turnout, talk online actually decreases it. Seeing party ads on social media also demobilizes the electorate. In a second, we can speculate about all the different mechanisms behind these effects, right? But if you think about party ads on social media in particular, again, biased political content, this is also something that people might just find annoying, that they don't want to see on a social network sites, that they then shrug off, and it demotivates them. Event attendance. If people attend events that relate to the campaign more often, they are less likely to turn out. And this effect is really something that puzzled us, and we have looked at this in the different member states that we investigated, and we find this effect is again consistent. So the more likely people are to attend an event that is in any way election related, and you have to keep in mind that can also be in a negative way. Say a protest against the EU is also in some way election related, right? Then this will decrease the likelihood that they will turn out to vote. And then last, active online communication. For example, post something on social media, who you voted for, what you voted, decreases actual participation as well. Sorry, not who you voted for or what you voted, but in the run-up to the elections. That encourages other people that they, for example, should go to vote. Again, I'll be happy to discuss some of the potential mechanisms behind these, and we also are struggling with some of these because it's quite interesting. This is data from more than 12,000 individuals in 10 different member states' countries, and we lack information about the actual content of these things. The content of the events, for example, that they attended, the content of the party ads that they saw online. And we learned from Stephen that content is critical. We need to know what actually happened in these. We would speculate about a potential toxic online campaign environment, at least in the context of the elections. And I want to make clear that this is not about the actual campaign by the parliament or the commission or the union. It's about the kind of information and discussions that people encounter online when they talk with others about politics. It has something to do with the heterogeneity of the discussions that we have. We are more likely to encounter opinion partners online that do not agree with us. And if I'm very much in favor of the EU and supportive of the EU, but engage online in discussions, then this might actually decrease my support for the Union and my turnout. It's not something we want to prevent. We want people to talk to each other, right? And to encounter discussions and discussion partners that help them take on different viewpoints. But it is something that we might need to take into account when we talk about social media. And the last point that also relates to the general traditional media, if you excuse me, is the perceived communicative untruthfulness of the media coverage in EU member states. And this is data from the same. We measured from the same 10 member states. We asked people about the extent to feel that the media do not report on politics or on events in a fair and unbiased manner. And we asked about the extent to which they feel that the media actively try to lie to people. So the dark red one, which is disinformation, is the perception that the media lie to people and follow their own agenda, versus the light red one is misinformation. Media just sometimes do not report accurately on events the way that happens. And you see there's a lot of variation in the 10 member states with regard to these perceptions, but this is something that we should probably also take into account in the future. It's not so much whether mis or disinformation or fake news actually are a problem in the EU, in the member states, but it's about whether people not believe it is and what they think about the influence of potentially bad media and lying media on their daily lives and on their counterparts. And that's that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Franziska. Of course, we started a bit late, but we still have time, so I will make sure to really keep just a few minutes for the conclusions and open the floor and try to keep to open up a discussion, a debate with you as much as we can, so we can start forward.
Thank you. My name is Peter Fjering. I'm from Denmark. I have a question where I also would like to challenge a bit Steve and Jens. And the question is if European Parliament elections at the end of the day are different elections in different countries. In my country, Denmark, a big topic was Brexit. And for many people, it was some kind of a wake-up call that they started to think, let's imagine a European continent without the EU. Let's imagine that all countries did as the UK. And the result was that an overwhelming majority voted for EU-positive candidates, EU-positive parties. We had record high turnout, participation. But it was not because of the campaigns operated from Brussels. It was because of a feeling that you can also get too negative with the EU. So my question is, I really question if you can operate campaigns and topics and digital means from Brussels centrally, because I also think that European Parliament elections are very different elections in different countries.
Yeah, I mean, first, Brexit was a big factor everywhere. It was actually part of the environment that this election took place in. And I'm at no point, I've actually tried to avoid claiming that our election campaign or the institutional election campaign was solely responsible for the increase in turnout. That's not true. There was a mood of the moment where I think exactly what you identified as happened. People were worried about the way things were going, and it caused a sort of a reaction, I think, to some extent. I have no problem about being a campaign that pushed at a door that was already partly open. But, I mean, I think we did contribute to that, and that's the important thing that we did. We didn't do the same thing everywhere, in fact. And in Denmark, I know Denmark reasonably well because I've been there quite a lot one way or another and talked a lot about the campaign in Denmark. And it was very different in Denmark. The way things worked there were different. And if I had to sort of draw more lessons from this campaign, maybe slightly on what we didn't get quite right at the beginning is we should have appreciated more how different it would be to try and run this mobilization campaign in very different places. And it did end up working very differently. In some places, the online mobilization, this volunteering culture was very strong. Germany, Netherlands, UK, Spain actually as well. In some places, including Scandinavia, that kind of thing, people giving their email address was not so popular, but they wanted to work in sort of civic society organizations much more. And there was a very powerful culture of sort of grassroots democracy in that way. So it took us a little while to get it, but we got it, and then we really shifted what we did and worked with those kind of people. It wasn't all about us. it never was, and that's one of the points I tried to make, that this was about a lot of people getting together on this campaign in their different ways in their different countries.
Just to compliment, indeed, I mean, I hope I was not misunderstood. I mean, by no means I would claim that really the voter turnout really is attributable only to European level institutional campaigns. That is clearly not the case, and I said that at the beginning. And secondly, I think it's very important also that we make very clear that the times are over where the Commission or the institutions probably consider a one-size-fits-all approach as an effective approach. I think this is over. I think nobody would still think in terms of institutional communication, corporate communication, that we can have effective communication in all member states in the same way. So that's why precisely we cherish really the role of our representations and on the parliament side of the EP liaison offices to fine-tune and target messages to national audiences or regional audiences, because even there are of course different sensitivities and concerns and aspirations. So I think this is precisely on Commission side what we are doing with the corporate campaigns that I mentioned.
Thank you. My name is Mikko Salo, and I've been following the European elections since 2014. Sorry. Yeah, my name is Mikko Salo. I'm representing a transparency NGO that was running a fact-checking effort called Faktabaari, and we have followed the European elections since the last effort. I would still try to come to the disinformation part, even though I understand that people want to keep the mood good, because I mean, the mood is different and the debate is different than the last year when we were all afraid of the worst. But I mean, I have to say that the threat is not anywhere and not done. And I mean, now things should happen. And in this view, I would be very happy if you could still kind of a little bit go about the cooperation between the institutions and what the lessons learned on that side, even if I know that it's a very difficult topic, but this is very, very timely now to get right, because the next elections is going to be much more complicated in this front. Sorry to bother always the kind of the positive news and the narrative things, but let's say the truth matters still outside all the good and nice communication efforts that EU succeeded certainly better than before. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your question, and on the contrary, we are always really happy to have a real debate, a real discussion, and also, as always, we should not shy away from what did not work, or even worse, from what can be very dangerous for our future efforts. So thank you very much for bringing this up. I don't know who wants maybe to start, if Jens or Steven. We go again for Steven.
Sorry, I don't want to dominate or anything, but yeah, this is always really, really difficult, and I don't think anybody has an answer to it. There are a lot of mechanisms being put in place. There were before this election a lot of interinstitutional mechanisms between the European institutions, indeed some various national services, to try and address the problem of disinformation. Identify stories early, rebut early, all that kind of thing. Identify the sources of the stories, but you might say it's like trying to hold back the incoming tide to some extent. My own feeling about it is that one thing that happened here in this election campaign is that there was, and again, I'm not claiming any sort of credit for this, but there was a counter-narrative. The positive message was there and fighting against that incoming negative message. And you know, the tide was running in both directions and sort of meeting in the middle. And I think that was a very important part of it. Another thing I would say is that the technique of using, working with partners and volunteers and real people was also very positive in this sense, because when people talk to each other, and this was in Francisca's figures as well, that they believe each other. Who do people trust? People don't trust, as we saw from Francisca's slides there, they didn't trust the media so much anymore. They know they're being misinformed or disinformed, but when they're talking to a friend, a family member, or someone they identify with, which is what we were trying to achieve through this campaign, then they're going to get what they feel is a more reliable form of information, and at least more measured and less sort of trolly and just generally horrible. And I think that maybe also happened in this campaign, or in this, broadly in the lead up to this election as well. So long may it continue.
Yes, I fully agree with Steve. Of course, the fight against disinformation continues beyond the election, and it would be totally wrong to reduce efforts in that regard. I think the president-elect of the new commission, Mrs. von der Leyen, has also made it very clear that this is also at the heart of the new commission's priorities. You're aware that one of the 6 new priorities will be precisely a new push for European democracy, and the fight against disinformation is clearly an important element in that part, together with, of course, also improving the lead candidate system and also tackle the issue of transnational lists. So this is all in the political pipeline clearly, and at our level, the institutions continue working together with the External Action Service to keep the cruising speed that we are at now, and further improve also the capacity the collective capacity, including with member states, by the way, to detect and counter disinformation. But most importantly, and there really what Steve says is extremely important, let's not reduce the fight against disinformation against rebutting wrong information or disinformation and lies and attacks against the EU. It starts earlier. It is really about the promotion of positive messages, all truthful, facts-based, of course, but possibly combined with emotions that in the end will vaccinate citizens, so that when the moment comes that disinformation arrives, that they at least have doubts that this potentially is not true.
Thank you very much. I think we have time for one more question from the audience. Over there, please.
Hello, my name is Sarah. I'm from Commission's Knowledge Center on Migration and Demography. And migration is one of the topics that is very frequently used to manipulate and disinform or misinform public. I was wondering about misinformation. Did you need, during your campaigning, to adapt your campaign to misinformation that was coming from maybe social media, or it was planned and it went smoothly from the beginning till the end? Do you have any concrete examples, like we had problems with migration and we need to a bit, let's say, reshape our stories around it? Then my second question is about Facebook. Will there be any institutional maybe arrangement with Facebook about misinformation, disinformation also for future? Because also this shutting down the possibility to have political ads, it's very important, and we cannot just leave it to Facebook's decision of what they want to do one day. Will they allow some information or not? It's too important to leave it all to the private sector. So what would you do? What are you thinking to do in the future regarding Facebook, for example? Thank you.
Starting with your Facebook-related question, I mean, by now we also have similar developments on Twitter, of course, but let's be very clear. It's absolutely justified if such internet platforms try to maximize transparency on what is happening on them. So that is clearly in line with the overall objective of our EU action plan against disinformation. We want transparency on political advertising, that is clear. For the rest, it should also be clear that what they did is not building on any political or legal constraints from the European level. I think this also needs to be said. It's a commercial decision from these platforms. It's not that the EU is forcing them to apply it in that way. So in that sense, it's something we also need to sort of see how to tackle in the medium and long run. Ahead of the elections, we had luckily an exception for the EU communication and campaigns for all the institutions that we could continue until the elections to communicate and reach out to people as it was planned. So they announced it at the end of March. So really in the last phase before the elections, and luckily they rather quickly, upon some important context from the institutions, then granted an exception to that.
Of course, you raised a crucial concern, which will become even more difficult to tackle, thinking about the future. Should the project of transnational lists for the European election be brought forward, what will be the impact of these limitations to the political transnational advertising? I guess that there's a lot still to come and a lot of food for thought for the future. In the meanwhile, we have approached we're very close to the end of our session. So from my side, allow me really, I'll try to keep this to a couple of minutes. The discussion has been extremely dense, and I'm not going to wrap up everything that was said. I'm just saying very few things. First of all, yes, the turnout at the election was higher than expected, and even based on common sense, anecdotal, personal experience, we can say that people, voters, were exposed to the campaigns. The level, the magnitude of the impact of the campaign is very difficult to measure. Still, we can say that, as Steve rightly said, maybe the campaign pushed a little bit an open door, but certainly they had an impact. Now, is this enough? Certainly not. Certainly not. It's a good start. But I don't want to focus on what's next because it's too difficult. Allow me just to go back to what I think are the reasons for this. I've had the chance to meet all the colleagues at various stages of my career, and I think I've been into communication for 20 years, 15 of which almost at the European Commission, within the European institutions, Parliament, Commission, Committee of the Regions. One key element that certainly is striking, looking at things from the inside, and I don't know if colleagues would agree, but I put this just on the table for discussion, is that certainly what changed within the EU institutions in the last 15 years was that more and more the communication was professionalized. Not even sure that this makes sense in English or it's correct, but I'm sure that you get what I'm saying. More and more, the EU institutions have been looking at the communication with different eyes. Recruitment via specific competitions for communicators. Recruitment of communicator specialists from the private sector, from the media environment. A more focused approach, starting from the white paper on communication, Commissioner Wallström at the time, that really brought added value in the Commission representations and the Parliament delegations in national countries, in member states, adding more staff, more resources for communication. All of this certainly paved the way through the definition of communication strategy, actions, and ultimately to communication efforts that were more targeted, more professional, and more fit to the task. I just would like to have your impression about this last thing, and if you think that this gives also a bit of hope for the future, saying that probably we are not in safe hands, but certainly more and more the hands who are cooking this food are the right cooks, specialized in the right in the right recipes. Jens, maybe.
Yes, it's the right moment to ask this question because precisely we're asking that question of the new Commission under Mrs. von der Leyen. We're not leaning back now and think now we have got it right. Far from that. I think we're looking very much now into how to further increase our outreach to citizens. You remember Mrs. von der Leyen has clearly said that she wants bring Europe close to home. And this is not Brussels. This is also not the member states' capitals. It's in the regions, in the cities, in the villages. So this is where the political level, the commissioners, where the political actors, but also staff through back to school and back to university initiatives need to go if we want to be heard and seen as caring and taking up concerns by citizens. So that is clearly true. And then also the way to create a debate on certain policy issues before decisions are taken. I think this is another very important thing that we need to see and get better in terms of factoring in concerns and aspirations of people that we hear in citizens' dialogues or in the future conference on the future of Europe, and how to feed that back in good time into the policy making.
Thank you very much. Maybe a last.
Yeah, you asked whether professionalisation was the right word. It's exactly the word I would use for what's been going on over the last sort of 10, 15 years, for sure. It's about recruitment, it's about training, and it's about also investment. If you look at, if I compare the energy and the investment that goes into communication in the European Parliament and how that's developed over the last 15 years, if I look at the last 3 elections that I've been involved with one way or another, that certainly happened. And what's also happened is I remember in many training courses hearing the phrase that the communications department, the communications person needs to be in the room when the big decisions are being taken by the board, you know. And I think the equivalent has actually happened in the European Parliament as well, that when anything is discussed, the communication aspect seems to be one of the primary aspects that comes up always from the politicians, and also when it's a question of how to implement something administratively. DG Com, at least in the Parliament, and I think probably it's true in the Commission as well, are sort of in the room very much so now and seen as an integral part of how the whole thing works. And that, I guess, wasn't the case a while back. I'll leave it at that.
Absolutely the same situation in the Commission. The corporate spirit is there, and the notion that communication is or should be and increasingly is part of policy making. I think this is clearly a trend, and politically the Juncker Commission has already said that and outlined it for the future also in the Communication Europe in May 2019, just ahead of the CBU leaders meeting, that communication is not an afterthought to policy, but has to go hand in hand. And this will continue to be the basis on which we're going to work. By the way, an interesting related aspect is also how to increase the communication dimension among policy stakeholders and also beneficiaries of EU policies on the ground. But that's a totally additional subject. But under the new future long-term budget of the European Union, I think there needs to be an increasing effort also from the side of beneficiaries to own not only the funds that they are using to implement their own projects, but also to communicate the European Union beyond their own project.
Steve Jobs, when talking to people that were raising issues, used to say, oh, there's an app for that. Europecom can say, oh, there's a workshop for that. So because we have a workshop focusing on this. And with this, and remember that Franziska, in any case, will be there to measure our efforts and to tell us if we get it wrong. I would really like to thank, first of all, you all for your availability, your participation, and your patience also. Reminding you that now next round of sessions will start at 4:30, and then don't forget that there's the evening reception with the Europecom birthday celebration at 6 o'clock in Atrium 5 and 6. And let me thank once again our speakers, Stephen Clark, Jens Mester, and Franziska Markart. Join me in an applause for